Welcome to 340, the podcast where we explore intimacy, relationships, and what makes us human. Before we begin today's episode, I want to connect this reflection to the last two solo episodes on the podcast. In Healing Self-Doubt, we talked about something very personal, the inner voice that questions our worth and how healing begins when we learn to meet ourselves with awareness and compassion. In the space between spaces, we explored what happens when we slow down enough to truly meet another human being, beyond performance, beyond roles, beyond defense. Today's conversation moves one step further out. Because when individuals live with chronic stress and self-doubt, and when relationships lose the space for presence, something similar begins to happen at the level of society. Polarization increases. Certainty replaces curiosity. Identity replaces dialogue. So today's reflection asks a broader question. What happens when an entire civilization becomes dysregulated? Let's explore that. Over the past years, through conversations, relationships, writing, and this podcast, I've been noticing a pattern. People are not just tired. They are overloaded. Emotionally, mentally, relationally. And at the same time, the world around us seems to move faster than ever. So I started asking myself a question. What happens when a civilization accelerates faster than the human nervous system can adapt? This episode is a reflection on that question. So what happens when a civilization accelerates faster than the human heart can adapt? There's something I've been circling for a while. Not as a conclusion, not as a political stance, but as a reflection. I've been noticing how much of our modern world is built on acceleration, productivity, output, scale, optimization, visibility, faster, more, bigger, better. And with that, very little space for recovery, for reflection, for integration. We don't reward stillness. We don't celebrate death. We rarely prioritize restoration. And I keep asking myself, what does that do to the human nervous system? What does it do to our capacity for presence? What does it do to relationships, to intimacy, to the way men and women meet each other? This isn't about blaming a gender. This is not about criticizing religion. It's not about left or right. It's about integration. It builds on conversations we've had before, reflections inspired by thinkers like Eckhart Tolle about identification, presence, and what happens when we lose contact with ourselves. So today, I want to go deeper. Are we living in a fragmented civilization? Or are we simply overwhelmed? And maybe the real question isn't which side is right, but whether we are able to see the whole system we are part of. And if we are, what would integration actually look like? Welcome to 340, the podcast where we explore intimacy, relationships, and what makes us human. Part 1. The Age of Acceleration. If we zoom out for a moment, I think one of the most defining forces of modern life is acceleration. Not just that we're busy, but the entire system is designed to speed up. And a socialist named Hartmut Rosa talks about this directly. He uses the term social acceleration. The idea that modernity keeps increasing the pace of life across multiple layers. Not only technology, not only markets, but time itself as a lived experience. He describes acceleration in three forms. First, technological acceleration. Everything becomes faster. Communication, productivity, delivery. We can send a message instantly across the planet. We can order something with one click and expect it tomorrow. We can get answers in seconds. That sounds like freedom, and it is in one sense. But it also changes our baseline. The pace becomes normal. Second, acceleration of social change. Norms change faster. Culture changes faster. The rules of what a good life looks like change every few years. Careers shift. Relationships shift. Identity shifts. Entire industries appear and disappear. So the ground feels less stable. Third, acceleration of the pace of life. We compress more into the same 24 hours. More meetings, more messages, more context switching, more tasks, more social obligations, more content, more decisions. Just more. And Rosa's deeper point is, even when technology saves time, we don't get more rest. We fill the saved time with more activity. So the system doesn't lead to recovery. It leads to intensification. And you can feel this in everyday life. People eat while checking emails. Couples watch Netflix while scrolling. Parents are present physically, but mentally split when they are with their children. Even relaxation becomes optimized. Biohacking, morning routines, sleep score. We don't just live, we manage ourselves. And if I'm honest, I notice this in my own life too. I've spent many years building businesses, writing, speaking, constantly moving forward. And at one point I realized something strange. I had become very capable, but not always very present. Even when technology saves time, we rarely slow down. We fill the space with more input, more conversations, more projects. Acceleration doesn't only change our calendars, it changes our inner state. And when our inner state changes, the way we interpret the world begins to change as well. What once looked like complexity can begin to look like threat. The system doesn't just accelerate around us. We internalize the acceleration. And that's where another thinker becomes really relevant. Byung-Chul Han and the Burnout Society. The Korean-German political philosopher Byung-Chul Han wrote a book called The Burnout Society, and his argument is sharp. In modern life, we don't need an external oppressor the way societies once did. We oppress ourselves. We internalize the pressure. He describes a shift from what you could call a disciplinary society, where someone tells you what to do, to an achievement society, where you tell yourself what to do. Nobody has to whip you. You whip yourself. Because you've been trained to believe, if you're not producing, you're falling behind. If you're not improving, you're failing. If you're not visible, you're irrelevant. And the language changes. It becomes, I choose to do this. I want to build this. I'm motivated. But underneath, there's often a subtle fear. If I stop, I lose. Han's point isn't ambition is bad. His point is that when productivity becomes identity, people don't just get tired, they burn out. Because the system has no natural endpoint. There is no enough. And this is where the conversation starts to touch relationships. Because when people internalize performance, they often bring performance into love. Performing competence, performing independence, performing attractiveness, performing success, performing being fine. And then intimacy suffers. Because intimacy requires something we don't reward. Being imperfect, being slow, being real. Gabor Maté and the chronic stress that disconnects us from authenticity. And this is where Gabor Maté becomes important. Maté's work isn't really about gender. It's about how chronic stress and trauma shape behavior. One of his core insights is when the nervous system is under prolonged stress, we become adaptive rather than authentic. We shape ourselves to survive, not to be whole. And here's a simple, concrete example. If you grew up learning that love was conditional, love came when you performed, succeeded, behaved, pleased, then you may become a high-performing adult who constantly delivers. Not because you're free, but because your nervous system learned performance equals safety. And when performance equals safety, rest feels dangerous. Stillness feels unsafe. Vulnerability feels unsafe. Then you have people who can achieve anything, but can't relax into love. Maté also emphasizes how modern society reinforces this because it rewards the adaptation. It rewards the strong. It rewards the capable. It rewards the one who never breaks. So the person gets praised for their coping strategy until it collapses. And again, this is not only men or women, it's both. But it becomes extremely relevant in modern relationships because it creates a culture where many people are functional but not connected. I will also notice this in conversations with many people around me. Highly capable people, high performers, people who manage companies, families, responsibilities. And yet, sometimes when you ask them a simple question, when do you actually rest? There's a long pause. I remember noticing this very clearly in my own life at one point. Everything looked functional on the surface. Work worked, life worked, I was productive, responsible, moving forward. But if someone had asked me a simple question like, when do you actually slow down? I'm not sure I would have had a clear answer. And I realized something important there. Functionality is not the same thing as connection. Stephen Porges and the polyvagal theory, why stress creates defensiveness. Now, let's add neuroscience. Stephen Porges developed polyvagal theory, which gives us a way to understand safety and connection biologically. The simplified version is, when we feel safe, we can connect. When we feel threatened, we protect ourselves. And threat is not only physical. Threat can be emotional unpredictability, reaction, shame, conflict, disapproval, losing status, losing control. So if you live in a world that keeps your nervous system activated, deadlines, constant input, constant evaluation, your body becomes more defensive. You become more reactive, less patient, less curious, more binary. And that's not a moral failure, that's like physiology. And one of the strongest relational insights from this is intimacy requires safety, not just emotionally, nervously. And this is something many people recognize if they've ever had a conflict in a relationship. Two people can love each other deeply, but if both nervous systems are activated, tired, stressed, overloaded, the conversation suddenly becomes impossible. Not because the love disappeared, but because the nervous system no longer feels safe enough to stay open. If your nervous system is chronically activated, intimacy becomes harder, even if you love the person. Because connection requires your body to feel, I can soften here. And our culture often does the opposite. It trains us to stay sharp. The key insight. Acceleration doesn't only change our calendars, it changes our inner state. It pushes us toward a specific energetic mode of being linear, goal-oriented, structured, directional, and outcome-focused. If we use archetypal language, not gender, but energy, those qualities resemble what many traditions call masculine energy. Direction, focus, execution, penetration of goals, achievement. Again, not men, energy patterns. Every human being carries both. This is not biology, it's pattern recognition. And when an entire culture becomes dominated by that mode, what happens to the complementary qualities? What happens to cyclicality, rest, intuition, embodiment, emotional depth, relational presence? Those are often described as feminine principles, not women, but principles. The issue is not masculinity. The issue is systematic overemphasis on one mode of being. And when that happens, people, men and women, start losing access to parts of themselves. They get more productive, but less whole. They become more efficient, but less human. And when human begins lose wholeness, they start looking for someone to blame. And that's when polarization becomes tempting, because blaming gives you certainty. Integration requires maturity. Once you start seeing the world through the lens of the nervous system, a lot of things begin to make sense. Not just personal conflicts, but cultural ones. So the next question is, how does this over-accelerated, dysregulated culture feed polarization between men and women, between ideologies, between identities? Let's go there. Part 2. Polarization as a nervous system phenomena. We often talk about polarization as if it's primarily ideological, as if people are simply disagreeing on policies, values, or facts. But I think that's only the surface. Underneath ideology, there's something more primal. The nervous system, the need for safety, the need for belonging, the need for certainty. And when those needs are threatened, human beings don't become more nuanced. They become more tribal. Jonathan Haidt, Moral Outrage and the Tribal Mind. Political psychologist Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of work on moral psychology. I can recommend The Righteous Mind, and one of his core insights is that we don't reason our way into most of our positions. We feel our way into them. We tend to react first, emotionally and morally, and then we build arguments afterward. That's not because people are stupid, that's because we're human. Haidt often uses the metaphor of the elephant and the rider. The elephant is intuition, emotion, and moral instinct. The rider is reasoning. The rider thinks he's in control, but the elephant moves first. So when something triggers moral outrage, something that feels like an attack on our values, our identity, our group, our reaction is immediate. We feel, this is wrong, this is dangerous, these people are the problem. Then we search for reasons. And moral outrage does something even more powerful. It makes us feel righteous. Outrage is addictive because it gives us certainty. It gives us a clear division. Good people and bad people. The awake and the ignorant. The safe and the threat. And the moment your nervous system feels that threat signal, nuance collapses. A concrete example, how it shows up in everyday conversations. You see it when a discussion shifts from, I disagree with you, to, what kind of person would even believe that? That's the move from ideas to identity. And once it becomes identity, it becomes war. Because now you're not attacking my argument, you're attacking me. Lisa Feldman Barrett, the brain predicts and categorizes under stress. So let's add neuroscience. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett argues in How Emotions Are Made that the brain is not a neutral observer of reality. It's a prediction machine. It constantly tries to categorize what's happening so it can prepare the body to respond. And under stress, the brain becomes more aggressive in its categorization. Because uncertainty costs energy, nuance costs energy, complexity costs energy. So when we're activated, the brain tends to collapse complexity into fast categories. Friend, enemy, safe, unsafe, right, wrong, us, them. This is one of the most important points. Polarization is an energy-saving strategy. It's the brain saying, I don't have the resources to hold complexity right now. So it simplifies. So here's a simple lived example. If you've ever had a hard day, stress, deadlines, no sleep, and then a partner asks you something innocent, and you snap. That's not ideology. That's the brain under load. It's the nervous system trying to reduce complexity. And when millions of people live like that, chronically loaded, polarization becomes the default. Social media amplification and why emotions win. Now take that nervous system tendency and put it inside social platforms. Multiple studies and analysis, including work associated with places like MIT and Stanford, have shown that emotionally arousing content spreads faster than nuanced content. Outrage travels, calm reflection doesn't. That's not because calm reflection has no value, it's because it doesn't trigger the same neurochemical response. Outrage is activating. It gives us a hit of adrenaline, dopamine, certainty, belonging. And it creates an immediate tribal reward. I'm with my people. So the platform doesn't just reflect polarization, it incentivizes it. And over time, it trains us. We learn that being extreme gets attention, that being complex gets ignored. So a key pattern is the feedback loop. And it's brutal. Stress leads to simplification, simplification to identity attachment, which leads to conflict, and that results in more stress. Let me unpack that. So stress. People feel overloaded, uncertain, rushed, emotionally unsafe. Then simplification hits. The brain tries to reduce complexity. Who's the problem? And that leads to identity attachment. We attach to groups, labels, ideologies, because identity gives us certainty. And that leads to conflict, where identity creates enemies. And enemies creates moral warfare. And all of that leads to more stress. And conflict increases threat perception. And the cycle continues. And here's the key line. This isn't primarily about men versus women. It's about a collective nervous system that's living in a low-grade state of threat. Eckhart Tolle, identification strengthens egoic defense. This is where Eckhart Tolle comes back. And I've mentioned him in a few earlier episodes. Because what Tolle points to is that subtle mechanism underneath all of this. When you identify with a form, a label, a belief, a role, the ego strengthens. And when the ego strengthens, it needs to defend itself. It needs to prove it's right. It needs to defeat the other. So the stronger the identity attachment, the stronger the reaction. And if you zoom out, this is what polarization really is. Identity without presence. Presence doesn't need an enemy. Ego does. Presence can hold paradox. Ego needs certainty. Presence can be curious. Ego needs to be right. Presence allows paradox, and ego demands certainty. And polarization at its core is identity without presence. So if we deepen the lens, cognitive load and framing. If we take this even further, psychologist Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman described two modes of thinking. System 1, fast, intuitive, emotional. And system 2, slow, reflective, analytical. System 2 requires energy. Under stress, system 1 dominates. So when a society is chronically overstimulated, fragmented attention, constant notifications, performance pressure, we default to fast thinking. Quick judgments, immediate reactions, shallow interpretation. And this isn't just about politics. It shows up in relationships. You're tired. Your partner says something neutral. You interpret it as criticism. That's not ideology. That's cognitive depletion. Technology and emotional amplification. So let's layer in technology. Sociologist Sherry Turklem has written about how we are increasingly alone together, more connected digitally, less present relationally. Digital spaces removes tone, nervous system cues, embodied context. which means we fill in the gaps, often with projection. And studies have shown that emotionally charged content spreads faster than nuanced content. Outrage travels, reflection does not. So the environment itself rewards reaction over integration. Framing and identity. Cognitive linguist George Lakoff explains that people don't primarily respond to facts. They respond to frames, narratives that activate identity. Once a frame activates who I am, debate becomes existential. You're no longer disagreeing with my idea. You're threatening my identity. And identity under threat becomes defensive, which brings us full circle. So let's bring it back. Polarization isn't simply ideological. It's physiological, cognitive, technological, identity-based. And when a culture is chronically accelerated and under pressure, identity becomes more rigid. That's when the gender discussion hardens. That's when nuance disappears. That's when we stop asking, how do we integrate? And start asking, who's to blame? Blame feels powerful. Integration feels slower. But integration requires safety. And safety requires space. And space is exactly what acceleration erodes. And when a culture is stressed, the simplest identity categories becomes the loudest. Man, woman, masculine, feminine, oppressor, victim, strong, weak. All binaries, all simplifications. So instead of asking, how do we integrate? We ask, who's to blame? And that's the tragedy, because blame feels powerful, but it creates more disconnection. Integration feels slower, but it creates wholeness. So the question becomes, how do we restore enough safety, individually and collectively, that we can hold complexity again? And that takes us to the next layer. If acceleration changes the nervous system, and if nervous systems under stress simplify the world into identities and enemies, then polarization may not be primarily ideological. It may be physiological. In the next episode, I want to explore what that means for relationships, for how men and women meet each other, for how masculine and feminine energies show up in modern life, and ultimately, what integration might actually look like. Stay open, stay honest, and stay present.